Patrick, so now we'll turn to you. I think Patrick McGovern needs no introduction to this audience. He is a prominent microbiologist, can I say it that way? An archaeologist. He will describe his professions probably more eloquently. He's representing University of Pennsylvania Museum, and he had played a very integral and important role in the process of this scientific research that produced ultimately this article that was mentioned several times already in proceedings of National Academy of Science. He traveled the world. He found the oldest alcohol in the world. I think in China it was like beer from 9,000 years old. Of course, he traveled in many countries in Near East. And it was an honor to visit him at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, where he showed me some of his findings, jars from Zagros Mountains. But we are obviously most interested in his experience with Georgia. So,
okay,
Patrick,
very good.
The floor is
well,
yours.
I think you've already given me pretty much of an introduction here. I'm at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm head of the biomolecular archaeology project here for fermented beverages, cuisine, and health, because fermented beverages, already David was touching on this, it really starts much earlier, and we don't have the evidence, say, for the Paleolithic. We don't have the pottery vessels that we need to really analyze and determine it, but because of the physiological similarity of hominids in general and their very great interest in fermented beverages, we would suspect that they would have started experimenting and discovering how to make a fermented beverage at a very early date. And then we finally, come down to the Neolithic period, when we actually have pottery vessels that enable us to do the biomolecular tests that are necessary to see what kind of fermented beverage it might be. But my view is expressed in the various books and articles that I've read and published, is that fermented beverages are really very central to human culture and biology, and they interact in all different ways in terms of mind-altering experiences, religion, social relations. I mean, if you have a group of early humans in a cave, a fermented beverage might bring them together as a group more easily. It generates new ideas, music, art, even language can be involved here. And so this is why this subject, I think, is so important. And it doesn't just include wine or wine made from grapes. It could include wines made from many other kinds of fruits. And, of course, beer and honey that can be easily turned into mead. So it's a very fascinating subject, I think. And Georgia, with its Qvevri, carries on in a tradition that is really quite amazing. And we've been very fortunate to be involved in the project with our colleagues in trying to figure out what is some of the earliest evidence for grape wine. Now, the article in the PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, has already been mentioned. And you'll see here, many different scholars coming at this question of Neolithic wine from all different perspectives. So it's not just biomolecular archaeology or archaeological chemistry that's involved here, but we're talking about archaeobotany, like Laurent Bouby, climatic studies, such as what Osvaldo, Gabriel, and Luigi do, genetic studies, Roberto. So there are Europeans, and then there's also Georgians doing archaeobotany studies like Nana and Eliso and so forth. And then archaeologists, of course, Mindy and Steve, and then some of the scientists that I work with very closely, such as Mike Callahan and Karen Smith and Gretchen Hall. So it's really been a very integrated interdisciplinary study that we've carried out here, which has led to these findings. And we were able to bring some of the people together, most of them at a conference which took place in Bordeaux back in 2017. And you see, I'm standing right next to a very large Cuevre, maybe thousands of liters. And then Tina Caselli, who has been very instrumental in getting the project off the ground, as well as others in the departments in Georgia and at the Wine Institute. So I think that we really have put together an excellent project here, which then can be extended to these other countries, as David mentioned, that surround the Fertile Crescent, especially in the mountainous regions where grape wine was developed. So I'll stop there and ask for any comments that you might have, and then move on to the next segment.
One comment or sort of maybe clarification here is that you come to this from, since we mentioned this article, your contribution was actually the dating of the findings that you discovered. Am I correct?
Yes, that's very.
So, yes, go ahead.
So radiocarbon dating, which I didn't mention, has been done in Israel, and the samples that have been carried out are very narrowly dated between 6,000 and 5,800 BC. So there's no question that the evidence we're going to talk about in more detail from other disciplines is very well dated. And that's extremely important in establishing that the Georgian wine is the earliest yet found in the Near East.
So when we say 6,000 BC or 8,000 euros, we are not really bluffing, right?
No, I mean, that is a very, in my early career as a graduate student, I worked in a radiocarbon laboratory here at the University of Pennsylvania. And so I know the technique, fairly well. It's been developed extensively over the years. And if you, screen for any kind of contamination and you have multiple samples, you can be certain that we're dealing with the period from 6,000 to 5,800 BC.
Okay, thank you. Let's go ahead.
Okay, so my first trip to Georgia, just to briefly mention, this was back in 1998, quite a few years ago, when the wine industry had been decimated by Gorbachev and was not in the greatest shape. But that was the person on the right is the archaeologist Tamaz Kitsurets, who really was head of the Neolithic section at the museum at the time, and he was able to show me samples in the museum that we were able then to take back here to the United States, to Philadelphia, to carry out the analyses. And this is his sister Medea. And then this is Ravaz Ramashvili, who is a very excellent archaeobotanist who had samples of seeds that he thought might be Neolithic. Those have not turned out to be Neolithic, although at the time it seemed very exciting. So far, the radiocarbon dates have pointed to a later date, but we're still hopeful that we're going to get more evidence of actual seeds from the Neolithic. I'll be showing other archaeobotanical samples as we proceed. The pottery from the museum was especially important because we would have a chance to look for ancient organic materials that might indicate what the contents of the vessel were. So this is a base of a jar, probably a Cuevre type jar from the Neolithic period, from the important site of Shulavera Skora, in that area that David was talking about, in which we have a real concentration of Neolithic sites that are important to keep looking at and excavating. And that one sample looked very promising, so I call it sort of the smoking gun that Georgia might have the earliest wine in the Near East that we could document. Unfortunately, that sherd had been washed in hydrochloric acid, and it was just one sample. So it really did not provide the sort of evidence that we needed, and we had to put the study then of the Georgian sherds that I had collected in 1998 sort of on a back burner while we proceeded looking at other samples. Now, let me just show you, I mean, pottery is very important to this whole endeavor. And I'll just show you, this is a sherd from another jar from Iran. We're closed out here at the University of Penn Museum, so I wasn't able to get the actual Georgian samples down here into my office, but it gives you the example of a very early sherd, about 3000 BC from Iran, that has a reddish residue on it. I don't know if you can see that, but the inside has a reddish residue. Now, we don't always have to see an actual physical residue, because pottery as a clay will absorb liquids. And we were especially interested in the bases, where you'd get accumulations of precipitates, of material, falling out, and that's been absorbed then into the clay structure itself, and it is held in place by chemical forces, ionic forces, so that when we come along many years later and use our organic solvents like chloroform and methanol, we're able to extract out the ancient organics and then go through a whole series of study trying to figure out, what the organic compounds actually represent. Do they represent grape? Do they represent barley, beer, wheat? There's many different possibilities here. So this was a smoking gun, and we also had other Neolithic vessels, jars primarily, and bowls, which had clay decorations on them, where they take strips of clay and they make different figures. And this one was particularly interesting because it shows these circular blobs of clay that were applied, and then it gets fired up, so it becomes a permanent decoration. And it suggested a person, maybe a sort of stick-like person, with his hands up in the air, celebrating perhaps some kind of a grape harvest, maybe associated with wine. And when I first went to Georgia and I saw this sherd, it sort of, was, some additional evidence that we might be dealing with very early wine from the Neolithic period. I was living in a house on the wall of the old city of Tbilisi, and I went back at night after working in the museum during the day, and I would have of course, my glass of Georgian wine and sit out on a veranda overlooking a public building, some sort of utility building. And I look up and there's like this frieze, set of designs going along the top of the building, which had this same stick-like figure under what I interpret as a grape arbor. So it was quite a revelation, and made me think that I was, onto something. So I'll stop there again and ask Mamuka or whoever if they have any comments or.
No, I think this what you are saying, Patrick, is that you see cultural footprint in the process of development related to wines. You mentioned several times pottery, and you worked a lot in different parts of the world on pottery. It's obviously the integral part of the cultural development of humans. Dated when? Maybe I'll ask you this question, and sort of where this
Right.
this process started.
Well, that's what I'm coming to right now, because we had an earlier discovery of wine from Iran. I've already mentioned one that was from 3000 BC, but we had another one 5000 BC, and that takes us to well, here I'll just mention my books that I've published a lot of this in, and raised the issue of Georgia possibly having the earliest, but not having good enough evidence at the time. When I first published the Ancient Wine book, it was back in 2003. And, I just put forward the possibility that we might have the smoking gun in the Caucasus, specifically Georgia. And then recently, I did an update, which, presents the evidence in the the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences article, along with other updating of information we have from the Near East and the Mediterranean and Europe about ancient wine, also from China, but I won't get into that too much. But then in this book, we did present the Neolithic period as the time when the first pottery is produced. And this is so important because, like I say, it absorbs the liquids that we can then identify what the contents of the vessels were. And it is when we have the first plant and animal domestication and first villages, probably, the first large-scale production of wine. I mean, you could have had minor production from wild grapes previously, but if you were able to domesticate the grape, as I'll explain later, you're able to produce a lot more grape juice that can be fermented into wine. And then you have cuisines that are based on all these domesticated plants and animals, including wine, beer, etc. But pottery is invented in the Neolithic period, around 6000 BC in the Near East. In China, it's actually at 16,000 BC. So China had a little bit of an edge on the Near East, but still, once we have pottery, we're able to then do our analyses using these different organic solvents, different techniques, which I'll be coming to. So after I'd been in Georgia, I came back and we had further study of some of the Iranian material, because the University of Pennsylvania Museum was very involved in excavations in Iran at that time, before the revolution. And so they excavated a site in 1968, not too far from Sholaveri and the Georgian sites of interest from the Neolithic period, called, in Iran, it was Haji Firuz Tepe, which is the site that you see here being excavated. And it dates between about 5400 BC and 5000 BC. So it's somewhat later than the 6000 BC that we have now for Georgia. And at the time, it was a quite an amazing discovery, because it did seem as if there was a large-scale production, because just ordinary houses would have many liters of wine, as our analyses showed, in just ordinary kitchens, possibly used for drinking and cooking. And in this case, we had 6 wine jars. 4 of them are in Tehran, 2 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. So we were able to get samples of the ones that were in the Penn Museum. It could be shown that they probably intentionally were trying to preserve the wine by using clay stoppers. They also added a tree resin that acts as an antioxidant and prevents acetic acid forming. And we focused at the time on one particular compound that's found in the Middle East in large amounts only in grapes, and that's tartaric acid, which is a very simple compound. Now, for the chemically challenged, I'm only going to give like a brief overview, but if you want to know more, of course, you can go on my website and look at the PNAS article and many other articles that we've done describing all the techniques that we use. In this case, you see an infrared spectrometer. We usually start with that. And the Haji Firuz samples, here you can see HF or Haji Firuz. The 2 jars that we had in the Penn Museum, one is now right at the beginning of the Near East exhibit that is just recently redone. So if you come to Philadelphia, once COVID is past, hopefully, you can see this jar up close, and at least the outside of it. Now the inside of it, one of them had a reddish deposit, which we think is a red wine. Another had the yellowish deposit that you see here, suggesting it's a white wine. So that was interesting. And since this discovery was made, I guess around, I forget now exactly the date, but it's like the last 2 decades, it's been claimed as the world's oldest wine in the Guinness Book of Records. And soon after our discovery of the Georgian wine, that had to be changed. So it's the 2nd oldest wine in the world. And the question then was there something earlier? And I'll stop there because there might be some questions.
Yeah, you mentioned one detail that so Middle East started development of pottery in the 6,000 years ago. Was it correct?
Yes, 6,000
So
BC,
so it
8,000.
means that this coincides with the discovery of this pottery in Georgia.
Exactly. So
So
it's
which means that they probably were some prehistory of doing pottery in Caucasus before that, or no?
right. I think there's a lot of prehistory that we still don't know in all these areas, not just Georgia, but like the Caucasus and down into the Zagros Mountains of Iran and across to the Taurus Mountains. So we're really talking about an extensive area of the Neolithic period in which you have these discoveries being made, and and they're interacting with each other around and reaching a sort of a final stage at 6,000 BC, because before that, before pottery, we had items that were made of clay minerals, such as this jar from a site in eastern Turkey that is made out of a steatite type of material, and it has on the outside a design, and often these show birds and snakes and so on, or just geometric designs. But before pottery, they were able to take and carve out different kinds of containers that could have been used for processing wine. And we're still working on this project. This is one that has been ongoing. We haven't been able to really identify all the compounds and make a convincing case. So we're still working on this, but this is from Eastern Turkey. Now, I'm not sure if Georgia has examples of this. They're fairly widespread in the Euphrates Valley and the Fertile Crescent, these kinds of stone containers. And they really need to be looked at more closely because they're the ones that lead into making pottery. Now, pottery, because it's made from a clay emulsion, it can be formed into all different kinds of shapes, which can be used to make the wine, preserve the wine, serve the wine, and so on. So it really is a versatile material that is useful, for making wine and food in general. So it's very key in that respect as well.
Patrick, if I may ask, I don't know what's left in your presentation, but can you explain what actually indicates that there was a wine there? So I don't know. I mean, probably some of our listeners will be interested. What is the substance that is left on the pottery that proves that that is wine?
Well, I touched on this when I showed
Yeah.
this sherd that has a residue on the interior, a reddish residue. Now, we don't always see a residue, but often these residues indicate where a liquid would have been. Mm-hmm. And it's often on the bottom of the jar. Sometimes it's on the side if the jar was placed on its side. So it's very important to determine if you have a liquid grape juice. I mean, once you've established that it's grape that's involved, looking at tartaric acid and mm-hmm. other compounds that I'll be coming to, then you have to make a case that it was in liquid juice form, because especially in a warm climate, that juice is going to start to ferment very quickly because there's yeast associated with the grapes. And that is, just automatic in the first day or two that you're going to start to get wine produced. And the real issue is how do you keep it from going to vinegar, which I've already touched on. Yeah. So you might have some design on the outside of the vessel, like I showed. You might have later, of course, you have actual inscriptions, like in the Egyptian, once they've invented hieroglyphics, then they indicate, and I'll show some examples of this later. Mm-hmm. You have, wine as a word in ancient Egyptian placed on the outside of the vessels, so you know what the contents would have been. Sometimes the vessel is shaped in such a way that you can make a case for it being a wine vessel. So there's different ways you have to go at this, but the archaeological evidence coupled with the other evidence is you can start to build a case. You can never have 100% certainty in archaeology, but based on the evidence that you have, you can make a case for it, and then have different hypotheses that you can explore further. And if those turn out to be true, then you build up a very good case. That the contents of that vessel would have been wine, grape wine. Now, well, I'll talk more about the Georgian.
Yeah, but just one addition to comment that you mentioned the East, because where the grapes are, there's the East. That and a lot of people in the audience probably know that most of the query wines are actually done with the natural yeast, so no artificial yeast,
right,
because of there's a sort of micro world of grapes around the vineyards and around grapes and around those wine cellars where the wines are made. Go ahead, please.
That's very important, and we have geneticists on the project who are looking into establishing whether there might be genetic evidence, not just for grape, but also for yeast. And we did carry out a very early study from about 3000 BC of Egyptian wine that we were able to recover fragments of the yeast. And it was Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but it was slightly different. And there's an article on my website that explains, and goes into the details of this. But it's a very important discovery because, once we have the techniques available for genetically identifying yeast, we're going to learn a lot more. And the same with grape. So now let's turn to the Georgian evidence from the two different sites that they've been working on archaeologically, which are Shulaveri and Gadashrili. Here we see the typical circular buildings of the Neolithic period that are commonly found at all these sites. I think David was saying there might be something different at the new site that's being explored. That would be interesting to follow up on. It may be from an earlier period, pre-6000 BC. And in the PNAS article, we show the samples that gave us positives for tartaric acid and other organic acids in the residues that we recovered from these vessels. Now, you might wonder what we get out of the. Here's an example of we took a pottery sherd. In this case, I think it's let me just look here a little bit more. This is from a site in France, quite a bit later, maybe 500 BC, but we extracted it with chloroform and methanol, and we got out different organic compounds that you see here that are reddish. So you try to identify both whether it's a grape, you'd like to identify the pigments if possible, that's more difficult, and so forth. So we did the same thing with the sherds that you see here, including the Shulaveri sample that was the smoking gun that I talked about at the beginning, another Shulaveri base. And here you see the textile impressions showing how the vessel was formed on a potter's turnet or turntable. I don't know if you can see that, but there's concentric lines that go along the bottom. And this is the base. So it's equivalent to this one that's been reconstructed from the same period from another site, Karamas Didigora. This is from Gadashrili. It's a base. So we have not been able to extract this large jar, but it gives us a very clear idea of what these jars were like if we could reconstruct them. And there are various types of jars, very, very similar to the modern Qvevri or the more ancient Qvevris that have been discovered in Georgia, having a very small base, which is sort of curious because it wouldn't give much support if it were just standing in the open on a floor, let's say. It almost implies that you would have to bury it to make it stable, or put it in some kind of a potter's a pot holder of some kind, a rack. We don't really know how much of these were buried underground, and then why even have a base if you're going to bury it? maybe just tradition of some sort, you know, from an earlier period. It also is quite interesting, this complete jar, which is very large, maybe on the order of 300 liters. It has a plastic clay design that suggests a cluster of grapes. So that may be an indication of the contents of the vessel. So that would be one part of the argument, that we're maybe dealing with a wine Coevre. Just briefly to show you some of the chemical evidence, but not go into great detail, is what we normally do is use a very powerful technique called liquid chromatography, and then have a double bombardment to get the mass spec after it's broken down, and then look at when the compounds come off. And we look at a synthetic sample of tartaric acid and then the ancient jar. If they come off at the same time and they have the same molecular transition here, 149 to 87, 149 to 73, then we're very certain that we're dealing with tartaric acid. And we did the same thing with other organic acids in grape, which include malic acid, but these aren't as specific to grapes as tartaric acid. Citric acid is found in large amounts too, but they come off at different times. They have different mass specs. And then succinic acid is interesting because it forms during fermentation. So it's not in the original grape, but it's a product of fermentation, indicating the grape juice has probably been fermented. In addition, we have archaeobotanical evidence that points to grape, and this is done by some of our Georgian colleagues, which they were doing microscopic work looking at pollen remains, starch that's found in grape. It has particular shapes. They found some epidermal cells of grapevine, suggesting the grapevine was growing locally. So it would be a local wine that was being produced. And then also hairs from fruit flies, which even today, if you go to wineries, you'll see a lot of fruit flies usually gathering around because, like many insects, they're very interested in alcohol and sugar that they metabolize into energy. The Italian colleagues did a study of the climate for the sites, Sciulaveri, Gattisciuli, and so forth, south of Tbilisi, which using different measures of ancient pollen deposits in lakes, vegetation on hillsides and so forth in the Caucasus, they could determine that the Winkler index, which is a measure of the sunlight, the hours of sunlight that an area receives, fell within the 2300 to 2500 area, which is very similar to what southern France has and what parts of Tuscany have, and is very able, it's quite excellent for producing good grapes. So this is projecting the climatic data back into the Neolithic period. And so that's an additional argument that the grapes had an ideal situation for growing. So I'll stop there if you have any.
Patrick, thank you so much. I think we are just exhausted your time, but Levan just joined us, and again, welcome, Levan. We mentioned earlier that this project started in your conversation with David. David mentioned this earlier in his part of the presentation, and obviously this initiative and this multidisciplinary study that Patrick discussed was very important for in providing evidence of the story that we all heard many times and we're proud of, but there was a scientific backing now. There is scientific backing now for this claim of 8,000 years old Georgian wine. But as we've discussed earlier today, I mean, this is just a fragment of what we want to say. Most important thing we want to say is that history is great, but we also have great winemaking today, and great wines are produced in Georgia from many, many interesting grape varietals. I would like to, there's one question here from the audience. Patrick, maybe you answer that and we'll turn to Levan. There is a question about this caves in Areni in Armenia. Dating of that, when was that sort of, what is the base for that?
Yeah, I'm sorry my time has run out, but I was coming to that because I was going to go into the evidence of a wine culture in this whole general area of the Lesser Caucasus. And
go ahead, Levan gives us five minutes from his precious time, so you go ahead and finish your presentation.
So we all know that Georgia has a wine culture today that's very intense, and everybody who has an opportunity should go there and appreciate it. But it goes back into the Bronze Age at Trialeti and other sites. And, you know, we focused on this whole area. I mean, so we would like to do scientific studies, you know, throughout this area, and we're pursuing that. You know, Lebanon is quite interesting because when humans came out of Africa, say 200,000 years ago, they would have seen the grape, or, you know, hominids, you know, much earlier, they would have seen the grape for the first time right here, because this purple area is where the grape grows in the wild. And you'll see that Cholavari is up here, Haji Firuz, which I've already talked about, is over here. So, you know, we've done a lot of study, you know, trying to get the genetic information that we need from these areas. They're difficult areas to get samples from, and we can talk about that, but I want to get on here. This is a genetic study showing how Georgia and Armenia are very close to the wild Georgian samples are very close to the cultivated European samples. So that's why we think that the domesticated grape comes from the Near East. And then we get into the Qvevri question about how much underground these samples were. Now, we really need more evidence from Georgia, from the Bronze Age and Chalcolithic back to the Neolithic to determine this. And the sherds we've been working with, we really don't know to what extent they were above ground, below ground, half and half. This is from Armenia. In Egypt and Canaan, the fermentation is done above ground in the jars. And then we have Areni, which is the major discovery in Armenia, which I hope will be repeated in Georgia, in which inside a cave they had what, you know, can only be interpreted as Qvevri. Now, these are at the earliest 4000 BC down to 3500 BC, but they had grape seeds and branches and so forth that were preserved inside these jars, and the grapes apparently were stomped right next to the underground jars and went into it. So this is, you know, I think a very good evidence for Qvevri from the neighboring country, and we just need more evidence from Georgia to figure this out. But the wine culture, the domesticated grape, it extends out from this general mountainous area of the Near East. So we can say that for sure, but we need a lot more fine detail because it moves on to Egypt, it goes across to Italy around 700, 600 BC, on to France around 450, when they start to, you know, use the domesticated grape for all kinds of varietals. And Georgia is right in the picture on this whole question. So I just say that we really still have a lot more to learn, but that wine and this Eurasian grape, which is only one of many grape species around the world, is a very important question to get more information on, and it just intertwines culture, technology in so many different ways. So I hope that answers that question with a quick review too of.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you. Well, now thanks for your continuous sort of collaboration with us on our Winner Forum, and we hope to continue this collaboration. We hope many more discoveries from not just Georgia but around the region will come up, and we'll continue this conversation going forward.